Principled Disgust, Part 1 of 6.
In most traditions, religious or secular, repugnance is treated as a moral toxin, something to be eradicated from the emotional ecosystem. But here at the Union of Mystriks, we hold a deeper, more balanced view. Love and revulsion are siblings, responses to how we value the world. Love arises from kindness, honesty, and compassion. Disgust arises in opposition to deliberate cruelty, malignant dishonesty, malicious recklessness or negligence, and willful harm. Both compassion and disgust are responses to reality. To deny either one is to dull our moral intelligence. Some may suggest that legitimizing disgust in any form opens a door to abuse. But precisely because of this concern, we demand rigor, transparency, and ethical scaffolding around its use. Our standards are higher because the stakes are higher. The poison is in the dose. Kindness is not a vague sentiment for us. It is a measurable, evidence-based ethical framework grounded in deliberately and actively increasing well-being and reducing suffering for all life and nature's ecosystems. It is one of our core principles. We do not practice kindness because it feels good, though it often does, but because it works. It is the most effective strategy for sustaining long-term flourishing and cultivating the peace necessary for the fearless exploration of reality and the universe. Even this solid foundation has its limits. When applied without discernment, kindness can become a shield for the harmful and a weapon against the vulnerable. Unchecked compassion toward an architect of suffering is not neutrality. It is a betrayal. It permits the continuation of harm and becomes, in effect, further cruelty toward their victims. When we encounter those who knowingly dismantle or compromise well-being, or actively promote irrationality, moral disdain, or even hostility, it becomes protectively necessary. This isn't about being vindictive, it's punitive. Vindictiveness seeks to satisfy ego or retaliate for personal injury. Punitive action, by contrast, seeks to interrupt harm, uphold justice, and protect what is vulnerable. It's about acknowledging that compassion without discernment ceases to be compassion. It becomes negligence. For example, in an effort to promote tolerance and inclusion, UK authorities in the early 2000s were hesitant to act against extremist hate preachers, fearing accusations of discrimination. This excessive leniency, though rooted in kindness and cultural sensitivity, allowed radical ideologies to spread unchecked, contributing to homegrown extremism and public harm. The intention was compassion. The result was avoidable danger. Even kindness without boundaries can become complicit in the harm it seeks to prevent. Principled Disgust, Part 2 of 6. What is principled disgust? Principled disgust is not rage, it is not prejudice, it is reasoned antipathy. An ethically grounded, justified disgust at those actions, behaviors, or ideologies that cause intentional suffering are knowingly harmful and are consistently destructive. Intentionality means the harm is not accidental or incidental. It is done with a clear objective, carried out with forethought, calculation, strategy, or malicious negligence. Whether political, ideological, financial, or personal, the motive behind the action reveals a deliberate disregard for the well-being of others. This level of purpose sets it apart from impulsive mistakes or unconscious bias. For example, the architects of the Atlantic slave trade, from European shipowners and colonial administrators to African rulers and traders who sold captives, systematically built and maintained a transcontinental industry of human exploitation. This was not incidental harm. It was a calculated system designed to maximize economic profit at the cost of millions of lives, families, and cultures. Regardless of origin, participation in such a system was intentional, strategic, and profoundly unethical. Knowingness reflects a full awareness of the consequences. The individual or group understands the harm that will result, yet continues, sometimes even intensifying their efforts. This is the hallmark of moral corruption. Knowing what one does is damaging and persisting, indifferent or even pleased by the suffering caused. This is not about punishing ignorance, but holding accountable those who deliberately cause harm. For example, the Purdue Pharma case is a clear example of knowingness in harm. Despite overwhelming evidence of the addictive nature of OxyContin, Purdue executives aggressively marketed the drug as safe and non-addictive, targeting doctors and vulnerable communities. Internal documents later revealed that they were fully aware of the devastating consequences. Yet they continued to expand distribution, driven by profit, not ignorance. Consistency shows a repeated pattern of behavior or ideology over time. It is not a momentary lapse or isolated incident, but a sustained commitment to misinformation or destructive influence. The repetition forms a character, a brand, or a movement that reliably produces misery or spreads ignorance. It would be irrational to equate this with one-off human mistakes. We are not condemning imperfect people. We are responding to persistent calculated harm. For example, the Catholic Church's handling of clerical abuse cases spanned decades, continents, and leadership changes. Despite repeated evidence of systemic sexual abuse, the institution consistently protected abusers and silenced victims, revealing a pattern, not isolated errors. In such rare but serious cases, sanctioned outrage arises not despite our kindness, but because of it. Principled Disgust, Part 3 of 6. Who deserves critical condemnation? Disinformation architects. Those who knowingly spread disinformation that undermines health, safety, or education. This includes anti-vaccine activists who understand the scientific consensus but choose to propagate lies for personal fulfillment, fame, or political gain. It includes influencers who profit from conspiracies that erode public trust in evidence-based medicine, ethically accountable institutions of justice, the methods of science, and, ultimately, in one another. These are not innocents. They are dealers in confusion, harming people by proxy. We understand that not everyone who shares misinformation is malicious, but we differentiate between the misled and the misleading. For example, in 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic surged, conspiracy theorist David Icke falsely claimed that 5G technology caused the virus. His videos spread rapidly, resulting in real-world attacks on communication towers and disruption to emergency services. This is not harmless speculation. It's disinformation that endangers lives. Despite global debunking, Icke's ongoing dissemination of falsehoods makes him a clear example of someone who knowingly undermines public safety. Institutions of exploitation. Institutions that commodify suffering or marginalize entire populations for profit or power. Whether it be for sweatshop labor, corrupt prison systems, or exploitative healthcare models, these institutions thrive by turning misery into currency. They may wear the face of business, bureaucracy, or nationalism, but beneath is a knowing machine of harm. Critically, this is not an attack on all institutions or any particular political system. It is a condemnation of any structure that has abandoned ethical boundaries in pursuit of gain. For example, Nestlé, one of the world's largest food and beverage companies, has faced international criticism for its role in commodifying water, a basic human right. Nestlé has extracted and bottled water for profit in drought-affected regions, often leaving local communities with depleted resources. This is not merely aggressive capitalism, it is the systematic extraction of a life-sustaining resource from vulnerable populations for corporate gain. Promoters of proud irrationality. Leaders or movements that glorify irrationality, deny evidence, and teach others to do the same. This includes cults of personality, ideologues, and influencers who weaponize misinformation and anti-intellectualism. They don't merely resist the best approximation of truth, they train others to distrust it. Their ignorance is not innocent. It's an orchestrated rejection of honesty. And while free thought must be protected, organized deception must be resisted. For example, Alex Jones, founder of InfoWars, repeatedly claimed that the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting was a hoax. His platform harassed grieving parents, incited conspiracy-driven attacks on the victims and their supporters, and distorted public perception. Jones's actions are not just incorrect, they're cruel. They exemplify proud irrationality, weaponized against facts, decency, and mourning families. Principled Disgust, Part 4 of 6. From Rejection to Strategy, Ethical Opposition. Where principled disgust is emotional and philosophical, ethical opposition is its rational, tactical counterpart. It is not merely a reaction but a response, deliberate and measured. It arises when we recognize that certain harmful systems or individuals cannot be reasoned with, reformed, or disarmed through dialogue alone. When empathy fails and persuasion meets a wall, ethical opposition steps forward, not with vengeance, but with clarity and intention. This kind of resistance isn't rooted in bitterness. It doesn't thirst for domination. Instead, it functions as a protective force, forged in emotional honesty and rational care. It stands as a barrier between the forces of destruction and those who are vulnerable to being harmed. It aims to shield, oppose, contain, and outmaneuver what threatens the conditions necessary for well-being and discovery. Like all forces within the Mystrikal ethos, ethical opposition must remain subject to pause, reflection, and review. It must never become automatic or unexamined. Strategy without humility becomes cruelty. Resistance without introspection becomes dogma. We remain open to being wrong, even about our enemies, because ethical opposition isn't just about what we fight, but how we fight it. Some may argue this opens a door to intolerance. That's a valid concern. Let's be clear, though. What we reject is not diversity of opinion, nor the honest friction of differing views. What we oppose is that which actively undermines the conditions that make thoughtful disagreement even possible: dishonesty, dehumanization, manipulation, cruelty, and ideologies that erode the foundations of dialogue itself. For example, the grassroots resistance to family separation policies at the United States border offers a striking example of ethical opposition. When appeals to compassion were ignored and institutions remained complicit, citizens, lawyers, and aid workers organized legal challenges, direct support networks, and sustained public pressure. It wasn't an act of vengeance. It was a coordinated stand to protect vulnerable children and families from systemic harm. This movement didn't mirror the cruelty it opposed. It responded with strategic resolve and moral clarity. It illustrates how ethical opposition isn't about striking back. It's about standing between harm and the harmed, when dialogue alone has failed. Principled Disgust, Part 5 of 6. The Safeguards of Justified Revulsion. Unlike enduring principles such as honesty or humility, justified revulsion is volatile. It must be watched closely. Unexamined aversion can lead to collateral damage, moral misfires, and personal corruption. That is why Mystrikism insists on specific safeguards. Agility. Principled rejection must remain dynamic, not dogmatic. The world changes, so must we. If the harm we condemn fades, evolves, or is meaningfully addressed, our response must shift accordingly. Ethical opposition is not eternal punishment. We do not fossilize our antipathy. We adapt. What once demanded strong resistance may later call for forgiveness, dialogue, or closure. If our condemnation stays frozen while the facts move forward, we risk clinging to an outdated grudge, mistaking stagnation for virtue. Agility is how we ensure our revulsion stays tethered to the present, not the past. For example, former enemies in post-conflict Rwanda, including perpetrators of horrific violence, have, in many cases, reintegrated into society through the Gacaca court system, local community-led trials designed to promote reconciliation. What this shows is that condemnation, when no longer warranted, can evolve into dialogue. Moral judgment must be adaptable. Otherwise, it calcifies and obstructs healing. Proportionality. Our response must match the scale, intent, and impact of the harm. Not every misstep is a monstrosity. Overreactions, even when rooted in righteous anger, can become a form of harm in themselves. Proportionality reminds us to calibrate our outrage. It asks, are we responding to cruelty with clarity or with exaggeration? A minor breach of trust doesn't warrant exile. A flawed but redeemable figure doesn't deserve perpetual damnation. We must distinguish between patterns of systemic abuse and isolated errors, between ignorance and malice. Justice loses its credibility when its tone is out of tune with the crime. For example, during the Red Scare in 1950s America, Senator McCarthy's anti-communist campaign accused countless innocent people of subversion. Careers were destroyed, families torn apart, and freedoms curtailed, all in response to a perceived threat that was exaggerated beyond reason. Proportionality protects us from turning genuine concern into moral hysteria. Evidence. Revulsion must be earned, not assumed. Feelings alone are not a foundation for ethical action. They may spark investigation, but they do not stand in for proof. Mystrikism holds fast to the scientific method not just as a way of knowing, but as a way of resisting delusion. Condemnation without evidence is ideology masquerading as morality. It creates false villains, polarizes communities, and weakens real accountability. Before we oppose, we must examine. Before we denounce, we must verify. If we're wrong, we admit it. If we're right, we proceed, but always grounded in what is demonstrable, not what is merely believed. For example, in the Central Park 5 case, 5 teenagers were wrongfully convicted based on coerced confessions and lacking evidence. Years later, DNA evidence and a confession from the actual perpetrator exonerated them. Their lives had already been irreparably harmed. This tragedy underlines why revulsion, no matter how intense, must be rooted in verified evidence, not emotional momentum or social pressure. We must ask regularly, is this condemnation still necessary? Has anything changed? Has the individual, behavior, or system grown, reformed, or withdrawn? And if so, we adjust. These safeguards are not bureaucratic niceties, they are ethical boundaries that prevent us from becoming the very thing we oppose. Without agility, proportionality, and evidence-based justification, we risk slipping from sanctioned outrage into unjustified hostility. The very same tools that allow us to ethically stand against cruelty, irrationality, and suffering can easily become weapons of harm themselves if not rigorously and regularly examined. When repugnance becomes habitual or unaccountable, it ceases to be a moral response and begins to replicate the very cruelty we claim to resist. That is the danger of untethered condemnation. It loses its moral standing and becomes just another source of suffering. Mystrikism demands that our actions, no matter how emotionally charged, remain aligned with measurable well-being, clarity of evidence, and a willingness to evolve. In doing so, we preserve the integrity of our resistance and protect the ethical high ground from which it draws its strength. Principled Disgust, Part 6 of 6. Unexpressed antipathy becomes uncontrolled destruction. If principled disgust and justified revulsion are not given rational, protected outlets, they do not simply vanish. They rot. They twist inward. They manifest in uncontrolled, irrational, and unethical behaviors that sabotage both self and society. Antipathy is a natural state when we are confronted with ideologies, behaviors, and individuals that are morally disgusting, ethically repulsive, and consciously harmful. It must be named and rationally guided. Without that, Suppressed revulsion becomes destructive animal rage. Disappointment becomes dehumanization. And justice becomes indistinguishable from vengeance. Some may advise us to suppress these feelings altogether. But suppression is not peace. It is a deferred collapse. Safeguarded, sensible, and asseverated antipathy is ethical and essential to societal and personal mental health. For example, in post-World War I Germany, resentment over economic collapse and national humiliation was never fully addressed or healthily processed. This unexpressed collective anger fermented into nationalism, scapegoating, and ultimately, the rise of Nazism. When abhorrence is buried, instead of examined, it grows twisted and violent, turning a wounded society into a dangerous one. To live fully, ethically, and awake is to accept the complexity of human emotions. If awe can elevate us, then disgust can protect us. Mystrikism does not demand that we amputate half our nature to appear virtuous. It asks us to integrate and enlighten all our responses under the beacon of reason and ethics. We do not wield principled rejection lightly. But when safety is endangered, when honesty is distorted, when the best approximation of truth is weaponized, and when compassion is twisted into complicity, we should not remain silent. Even when we burn with justified revulsion, we respond with discipline, scientific integrity, and always with the intent to protect well-being, not to dominate or inflict further harm to the innocent.